Silk rustled against the cold marble floor as Harley stood paralyzed in the shadowed conservatory. Tomorrow, she was to become a duchess in the wedding of the century. Tonight, she watched her charming fiancé whisper promises of forever against her own cousin's lips. Everything she knew was a meticulously crafted lie. Spring of 1888 brought with it a feverish excitement that gripped the entirety of London's high society, but nowhere was the tension more palpable than within the sprawling walls of the Harrington estate. Harley Harrington was not merely planning a wedding. She was orchestrating an empire's coronation. As the only daughter of Lord Percival Harrington, a formidable magnate whose wealth had been built on miles of iron railway and steel mills, Harley carried the weight of her family's transition from new money to aristocratic legitimacy. Her marriage to Leopold Cavendish, the Duke of Westmoreland, was the final crucial puzzle piece in her father's grand design. Leopold was the undeniable catch of the season. He possessed the striking, chiseled features of generations of nobility, an effortless charm that could disarm the most cynical of dowagers, and a title that commanded immediate deference. However, what the society papers failed to mention, and what Harley's father had discovered through his ruthless solicitors, was that the Westmoreland coffers were completely devastatingly empty. Leopold's ancestors had gambled away the family fortune, leaving him with crumbling ancestral homes and mounting debts. The marriage was a practical arrangement. Dressed in the romantic silk of a love match, Leopold provided the title, and the Harringtons provided the staggering dowry required to save the dukedom from ruin. Despite the transactional nature of their initial engagement, Harley had fallen deeply, irretrievably in love. Leopold knew exactly how to play the devoted fiancé. He sent her rare white orchids imported from the continent, kissed her knuckles with a lingering warmth that sent shivers up her arms, and spoke of their future with a poetic reverence that completely blinded her to reality. Harley threw herself into the wedding preparations with a borderline obsessive dedication. She wanted everything to be flawless. She spent grueling hours with dressmakers selecting the finest lion silk and antique Belgian lace for a gown that required 4 seamstresses to carry. She agonized over the 6-course menu, the seating arrangements for 400 notoriously fickle aristocrats, and the precise floral arrangements that would cascade down the grand staircase of St. George's Chapel. She barely slept, fueling herself on strong tea and the intoxicating fantasy of her impending happily ever after. By her side, through every exhausting moment, was Josephine Montgomery. Josephine was Harley's orphaned first cousin, taken in by the Harrington family a decade prior after a devastating bout of consumption claimed both her parents. Where Harley was striking, composed, and dark-haired, Josephine was a picture of delicate, tragic beauty, with wide blue eyes and spun gold hair. Harley had always felt fiercely protective of her. She ensured Josephine had the finest governesses, generous allowances, and a prominent place in social circles, treating her not as a poor relation, but as a beloved sister. "You are working yourself into an early grave, Harley," Josephine would often say, bringing a silver tray of pastries into the chaotic study, where Harley reviewed ledgers and vendor contracts. Josephine would massage her cousin's tense shoulders, offering sweet, sympathetic smiles. "Leopold is a lucky man. He hardly deserves the torture you are putting yourself through to make his day perfect." "It is our day, Josie," Harley would reply, rubbing her tired eyes. "And once I am Duchess, I will ensure you are introduced to the finest gentleman in England. You will have a grand wedding of your own soon." Josephine's smile would never falter, though in retrospect the light in her eyes would always dim just a fraction. "You are too good to me, Jenny. Truly." As the wedding day approached, Harley's stress reached a boiling point. She began to notice minor, easily explainable oddities. Leopold would miss their scheduled afternoon rides, sending brief notes citing urgent business with his estate managers. Josephine would frequently disappear for hours, claiming she was running errands for the wedding or visiting the modiste for alterations to her maid-of-honor gown. Harley, buried under mountains of seating charts and floral invoices, thought nothing of it. She trusted them implicitly. They were the two pillars holding up her perfect, glittering world. The archives of the Harrington family records, later unearthed by historians, show that the financial transfers were finalized just 2 days before the wedding. Over £100,000, an astronomical sum for the era, was moved into the Cavendish accounts. The trap was set. The gilded cage was built. Harley had planned the perfect wedding, completely unaware that she was constructing her own execution. The eve of the wedding was celebrated with a lavish rehearsal dinner and ball at the Harringtons' London townhouse. The ballroom was a sensory overload of glittering crystal chandeliers, the intoxicating scent of hothouse lilies, and the sweeping melodies of a 30-piece string orchestra. Society's elite danced and drank champagne, toasting to the union of unparalleled wealth and unblemished nobility. Harley wore an emerald green velvet gown that brought out the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She smiled until her cheeks ached, accepting the hollow praises of lords and ladies who had previously turned their noses up at her family's industrial background. Yet despite the triumph of the evening, she felt a hollow ache in her chest. Leopold had been distant all night. He had danced the obligatory waltz with her, his hands polite but cold, his eyes constantly scanning the room over her shoulder. By midnight, the heat of the ballroom and the relentless social pleasantries became suffocating. Harley excused herself, desperately needing 5 minutes of silence and a breath of cool night air. She also wanted to find Leopold. She needed him to hold her just for a moment, to assure her that the exhausting spectacle of the past 6 months was worth it. She slipped away from the crowded dance floor, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the townhouse. The music faded into a muffled rhythmic hum as she approached the east wing, where the family's private library and a large glass-domed conservatory were located. The corridor was dark, lit only by the silver moonlight spilling through the tall windows. As Harley neared the entrance of the conservatory, she heard the low, unmistakable murmur of voices. She paused her satin slippers, silent against the Persian runner. She recognized the deep, aristocratic baritone instantly. It was Leopold. A fond smile touched her lips, and she stepped forward, intending to tease him for hiding from her father's endless toasts. But as she peered through the crack of the heavy mahogany doors, the breath was violently knocked from her lungs. Standing amidst the towering ferns and blooming camellias were Leopold and Josephine. But they were not merely talking. Leopold had Josephine pressed flush against a marble pillar, his hands tangled fiercely in her golden hair, his mouth locked over hers with a desperate, hungry passion that he had never not once shown Harley. Harley froze. Her heart stopped beating. The world tilted sharply on its axis. The silk of her gown rustled slightly, but the lovers were too consumed by each other to notice. Josephine broke the kiss, gasping softly. She rested her forehead against Leopold's chest, her hands tracing the lapels of his tailored evening coat. As she tilted her head back, the moonlight caught something glittering at her throat. Harley clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. It was the Harrington sapphire, her late mother's necklace, a priceless heirloom that Harley had planned to wear tomorrow. It had been missing from her vault since that morning. "We are taking too great a risk, Leo." Josephine whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with dark, thrilling excitement. "If she comes looking for you, let the dull creature look." Leopold scoffed, his voice dripping with a venomous disdain that made Harley's blood run like ice. He traced Josephine's jawline with his thumb. "By this time tomorrow the vows will be spoken. Her father's railway shares are already safely deposited in my accounts. The Westmoreland name is saved. And what of me? Josephine pouted, leaning into his touch. Am I to remain the pathetic charity case cousin while you play the devoted husband to that insufferable controlling merchant's daughter? Leopold let out a low, cruel laugh. You know my heart belongs to you, Josie. It always has since that first weekend in Sussex. Harley is nothing but a necessary transaction, a means to an end. She will be relegated to the west wing of the country estate, out of sight and out of mind. You will travel with me to Paris, to Rome. And in a few years— He paused, his tone turning dangerously cold. The countryside is notoriously dangerous. Accidents happen to careless horsewomen all the time. Once I am a grieving widower with full control of her estate, there will be no obstacle left for us. The words hit Harley like a physical blow. The betrayal was not just a lapse in judgment. It was a calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy. Her fiancé and her beloved cousin had been sleeping together, mocking her, and plotting her eventual murder to secure her fortune. A lesser woman might have burst through the doors in a fit of hysterical tears. She might have screamed, slapped them, and demanded the wedding be cancelled, causing a massive public scandal that would have ruined her family's reputation and left the Harringtons humiliated before the entire peerage. But Harley was her father's daughter. She possessed the same ruthless, strategic mind that had built a railway empire from dirt and iron. The tears that had pricked her eyes instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing fury. She did not make a sound. She stepped back into the shadows of the corridor, her face an unreadable mask of stone. She turned and walked away from the conservatory, her spine rigid, her mind racing with a terrifying, absolute clarity. She would not cancel the wedding. She would not give them the satisfaction of a panicked retreat, nor would she allow Leopold to walk away with a single penny of her father's hard-earned money. If Leopold and Josephine wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception, they were about to discover that Harley Harrington was the absolute master of the board. She needed to act immediately. As she re-entered the bustling ballroom, adjusting her expression into a polite, serene smile, her eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on a familiar face, Thomas Wright, her father's chief solicitor. Thomas was a fiercely intelligent, razor-sharp lawyer who harbored a deep, unspoken loyalty to Harley. Catching his eye, she gave a subtle nod toward the drawing room. The game had changed. The wedding of the century was still going to happen tomorrow, but it would not end with a happily ever after. It would end in absolute destruction. Shadows clung to the mahogany bookshelves of Lord Percival's private study as Harley firmly locked the heavy double doors behind Thomas Wright. Outside, the muffled strains of a waltz continued to play, completely ignorant of the empire-shattering revelation that had just occurred in the conservatory. Thomas, a man whose sharp features and tailored suits spoke of a life spent dissecting contracts in the unforgiving heart of London's financial district, stood by the unlit fireplace. He watched Harley with calculating eyes, noting the rigid set of her jaw and the complete absence of the bridal joy she had exhibited only an hour prior. "He is sleeping with Josephine," Harley stated. Her voice was devoid of tears, stripped down to a terrifying metallic calm. "And they are planning to murder me once the Cavendish accounts are fully fortified by my dowry." Thomas did not gasp. He did not offer useless platitudes. He simply stiffened his mind, immediately shifting from polite guest to the ruthless legal predator Lord Percival paid him handsomely to be. "Are you absolutely certain?" "I heard them plotting my fatal riding accident. Furthermore, Josephine is currently wearing the Harrington sapphire beneath her bodice, stolen from my private safe this very morning." Harley stepped toward his desk, her emerald gown dragging heavily across the Persian rug. "The £100,000 deposited to Leopold's ledger at Coutts and Company yesterday. Is it entirely unrecoverable?" "Not entirely," Thomas replied, stepping up beside her, his mind visibly racing through volumes of Victorian property law. "Your father is no fool, Harley. We anticipated that the Duke's creditors might attempt to seize the funds the moment they hit his account. Therefore, the transfer was executed under a strict escrow covenant. The funds are physically sitting in the Cavendish vaults at Coutts, yes, but they are encumbered by a legal lock. That lock is only broken when the parish registry is signed by both you and the Duke and witnessed by the Archbishop, legally finalizing the union. Until ink touches that parchment, the money legally belongs to the Harrington estate." A predatory smile, sharp and cold as shattered glass, finally graced Harley's lips. "Then we let him stand at the altar. We let him believe he has won. And then we sever his lifeline in front of the entire peerage. If we halt the wedding before the registry is signed, the funds revert to your father." Thomas confirmed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "But the scandal will belong entirely to the House of Westmoreland." Harley interrupted, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, brilliant fire. "I will not simply call off an engagement, Thomas. I want Leopold publicly ruined. I want his creditors swarming his ancestral estate by nightfall. And I want Josephine prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law for the theft of the sapphire. Can you arrange for the Metropolitan Police to be present at St. George's Chapel tomorrow? I have personal acquaintances at Scotland Yard. Chief Inspector Melville owes your father a considerable favour regarding the railway strike negotiations last autumn." Thomas said, pulling a gold pocket watch from his waistcoat. "I can have plainclothes officers stationed in the vestibule. But Harley, to execute this flawlessly, you must proceed with tomorrow morning exactly as planned. You cannot falter. You must walk down that aisle surrounded by 300 of the most powerful aristocrats in Europe and look at the man who wants you dead with absolute devotion. Watch me," she whispered. Morning broke over London with a cruel, mocking brilliance. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harley's bedchamber, illuminating the masterpiece of ivory silk, Brussels lace, and seed pearls that stood upon a dressmaker's dummy. Harley sat perfectly still at her vanity, as a team of maids pinned her heavy dark hair into an intricate coiffure, fastening a diamond tiara that belonged to the late Duchess of Westmoreland. Through the looking-glass, she watched Josephine enter the room. Her cousin wore a gown of pale lavender chiffon, looking every inch the angelic, supportive maid of honor. The sight of her so utterly flawless in her deception sent a spike of pure adrenaline through Harley's veins. "Oh, Jenny," Josephine breathed, clasping her hands over her chest. "You look like a queen. Leopold is going to weep when he sees you." "Do you think so, Josie?" Harley asked, her tone perfectly, even her eyes locking with Josephine's in the mirror. "I hope he gets exactly what he deserves today." "He deserves the world, and you are giving it to him," Josephine replied with a sickeningly sweet smile, stepping forward to adjust the lace at Harley's shoulder. As she leaned close, Harley's keen eyes caught the faint, unmistakable bulge beneath the high neckline of Josephine's gown. The sapphire. She was actually wearing the stolen £50,000 heirloom to the wedding, likely as a twisted private victory over the woman she intended to replace. "I noticed you are not wearing the sapphire," Josephine remarked, her tone feigning innocent surprise. "I thought you intended to wear your mother's necklace." "I decided against it," Harley lied effortlessly, turning away from the mirror. "It felt too heavy for today. I prefer to keep it safely locked away where no one can touch it." A fleeting shadow crossed Josephine's eyes, quickly replaced by a bright, hollow smile. "A wise choice. Now the carriages are waiting. All of London is gathered at St. George's. It is time to secure your future." Harley stood, the immense weight of the silk gown settling around her like armor. She did not feel like a bride. She felt like a general riding into battle. She took her father's arm, ignoring his anxious murmurs about her pale complexion, and descended the grand staircase. The ride to the chapel was a blur of cheering crowds lining the cobblestone streets, waving Union flags and tossing white rose petals beneath the carriage wheels. The Harringtons were essentially modern royalty, and the public adored the fairy tale narrative of the wealthy heiress saving the handsome duke. Little did they know the carriage was carrying a powder keg directly into the heart of the British aristocracy. St. George's Chapel was a cavernous masterpiece of Gothic architecture, filled to its vaulted ceilings with the intoxicating scent of thousands of white lilies and the hushed, expectant murmurs of the elite. As the heavy oak doors groaned open, the massive pipe organ thundered to life, playing a triumphant march that reverberated through Harley's very bones. She stepped into the central aisle, her father's grip tight on her arm. The congregation rose as one. Harley kept her gaze locked dead ahead, refusing to look at the sea of faces, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, Lord Salisbury, the Duchess of Devonshire, all gathered to witness a sacred vow that was in reality a blood pact. At the end of the long velvet-carpeted aisle stood Leopold. He wore the full ceremonial military dress of his ancestors, his chest adorned with medals he had never earned in battle. His golden hair perfectly swept back. He looked dangerously handsome, and as Harley approached, he offered her a smile of such convincing, profound love that she briefly marveled at his sociopathic brilliance. Standing slightly behind him and to the side was Josephine, clutching a bouquet of lavender orchids, her eyes shining with unshed tears of fake joy. Lord Percival kissed Harley's cheek and placed her gloved hand into Leopold's. His grip was firm, his skin warm. "You look breathtaking, my darling," Leopold murmured, leaning in close enough for her to smell the bergamot on his collar. "And you look exactly like a man who has won a fortune," Harley replied softly, her voice carrying only to his ears. Leopold's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion crossing his aristocratic features before he quickly recovered, turning to face the Archbishop of Canterbury. The ceremony commenced with agonizing slowness. The Archbishop's booming voice echoed off the ancient stone, speaking of sacred bonds, eternal devotion, and the holy sanctity of marriage. Harley stood perfectly still, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. She was acutely aware of Thomas Wright standing in the shadows of the side transept, accompanied by 3 men whose plain, sharply cut suits stood out starkly against the sea of silk and velvet. Finally, the Archbishop raised his hands, his gaze sweeping over the gathered hundreds. "Therefore, if any man can show any just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." A profound, heavy silence settled over the chapel. It was the customary pause, a purely theatrical moment that was never actually interrupted in polite society. The Archbishop drew a breath to continue. "I can," Harley said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a razor-sharp clarity that sliced through the suffocating silence of the chapel. The entire congregation gasped in unison, a collective sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Lord Percival turned pale, starting forward, but Thomas Wright stepped out of the shadows, raising a hand to stall him. Leopold stared at Harley, the colour draining rapidly from his face. "Harley, what are you doing?" he hissed, his grip tightening painfully on her hand. "Have you lost your mind?" Harley violently wrenched her hand from his grasp, stepping back so she could look at him with undisguised revulsion. "I am saving my life, Your Grace, and I am saving my father's fortune from a parasitic fraud." Chaos erupted in the pews. Whispers exploded into frantic murmurs. The Archbishop looked utterly bewildered, clutching his holy book as if it could shield him from the scandal. "My lords, ladies, and distinguished guests," Harley announced, projecting her voice so it reached the very back of the chapel. "I deeply apologize for this highly unconventional interruption. However, I cannot, in good conscience, pledge my life to a man who, just last night, plotted my murder with his mistress." A woman in the third row fainted. The Duke of Marlborough half stood, his monocle dropping from his eye. Leopold's face twisted from shock into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You hysterical bitch," he snarled, stepping toward her. "You have no idea what you are saying. She is exhausted. The wedding stress has driven her mad." "Mad?" Harley laughed, a cold, ringing sound that sent shivers through the crowd. "I assure you, Leopold, my mind has never been clearer." "Thomas." Thomas Wright strode briskly down the aisle, flanked by Chief Inspector Melville and his plainclothes officers. The sight of Scotland Yard in a royal chapel sent the aristocracy into absolute pandemonium. "Duke Cavendish." Thomas announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute legal authority. "I am officially serving you notice that the £100,000 placed in escrow at Coutts and Company has been frozen and recalled by the Harrington estate, citing fraudulent inducement and criminal conspiracy. Your creditors have already been notified. As of this moment, you are completely and utterly bankrupt." Leopold staggered back, as if physically struck, his eyes darting frantically toward the doors which were now blocked by the police. "This is absurd. You have no proof. This is slander of the highest order." "We have a witness to your conversation in the conservatory at midnight," Harley stated coldly. "Me?" She then turned her gaze slowly, deliberately toward Josephine. Her cousin was trembling violently, clutching her bouquet to her chest, her face ashen. "And as for proof of your criminal enterprise," Harley continued, walking slowly toward Josephine, her silk train gliding menacingly over the stone floor. "We can start with felony theft." "Jenny, please." Josephine whimpered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know what you are talking about. You are confused." "Am I?" Harley stopped mere inches from her cousin. Without a word of warning, she reached out and violently ripped the high lace neckline of Josephine's lavender gown downward. Gasps echoed through the cathedral as the heavy, undeniable brilliance of the Harrington sapphire spilled out from beneath the torn fabric, resting heavily against Josephine's collarbone. "That necklace," Harley declared, turning back to the horrified congregation, "was stolen from my private safe this morning. My cousin and my fiancée intended to pawn it in Paris, living on my father's money, until they could arrange an unfortunate riding accident to make Leopold a very wealthy widower." Inspector Melville stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Josephine's trembling shoulder. "Josephine Montgomery, you are under arrest for grand larceny. Duke Cavendish, you will accompany us to Scotland Yard for questioning regarding conspiracy to commit murder." Leopold didn't fight. The absolute totality of his ruin had paralyzed him. He stared at Harley, his aristocratic mask completely shattered, leaving only a hollow, pathetic man whose debts were finally coming to collect. As the officers stripped him of his ceremonial sword and hauled him down the aisle, the congregation parted like the Red Sea, shrinking away from him as if he carried the plague. Josephine sobbed hysterically, begging for mercy, pleading with Lord Percival, who turned his back on her in absolute disgust. When the heavy oak doors finally slammed shut behind the police, sealing the fate of the ruined Duke and the traitorous cousin, a deafening silence reclaimed St. George's Chapel. 300 of the most powerful people in the world sat frozen, staring at the bride left at the altar. Harley Harrington stood alone in a pool of sunlight. She took a deep breath, the suffocating weight of the past 6 months finally lifting from her shoulders. She turned to the Archbishop, offering him a polite, entirely composed nod. "I believe we are finished here," she said calmly. She turned and walked back down the long, velvet-carpeted aisle. She did not run. She did not cry. She walked with the slow, measured grace of a queen who had just conquered a kingdom. As she passed the pews, the aristocrats who had sneered at her industrial wealth now looked upon her with profound, unadulterated awe. Outside, the London sun was bright, the air crisp and clean. The perfect wedding had ended in absolute disaster, but Harley had never felt more alive. The Harrington fortune remained secure, the treacherous leeches had been excised from her life, and she was stepping into a future that belonged entirely to her. She had planned the perfect wedding, indeed, a perfect execution of vengeance that high society would whisper about for a century. Did Harley's brilliant revenge satisfy your craving for justice? Or did Leopold and Josephine deserve an even darker fate? Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from family, but nothing matches the fury of a bride scorned. If you loved this historical deep dive into high society's most scandalous wedding hit, that like button share this video with your fellow drama lovers and subscribe for more scandalous real-life stories.